Hello, and welcome to Reverend Matt's Monster Science, the live stream. Same stuff as usual. I won't be able to see your posts on the Twitch until the very end. So if there's anything you want me to, no, just save it because it might scroll away from existence. So we'll have the Q&A at the end like usual. Also, if you like, please donate. There's a link down below the screen here to the PayPal, and I'm also on Venmo as Matthew Kessen, Kessen. One special thing about donating this week is that this show was originally going to be put on at the Norway House, which is a local gallery and event space dedicated to Scandinavian culture, and they commissioned me to do a couple of shows, and that was going to be tonight, but obviously it can't, so I'm doing it from home. So if you were sent here by Norway House, if it's because of Norway House that you're watching and you would like to donate, then please make a note of that in the notes section of the donation. Let me know that you're here for Norway House, or if you just want to donate to Norway House. So that's a special thing. I'll repeat it at the end. So thank you very much, and let's begin. Hi, I'm Reverend Matt, and today we're going to be talking about the folkloric creatures of Scandinavia, or if my original typo had been left to stand, the Gulf-chloric creatures of Scandinavia. These are the creatures that people believed, or at least told their children that they believed, actually lived out in the woods and the rivers and so forth, and that could in fact be encountered by them, or if not by them, then by the sort of people who went into the woods and mountains carrying swords in case something needed to be chopped up very quickly. This is the second in a series of talks about Scandinavian monsters. The first was about the grand beasts of Norse mythology, the sun-devouring wolves and the serpents that girded the earth, and also there was this super big cow one time. But it was also great, and if you missed it, simply go back in time to when I gave it at the Norway House and watch it then. And if you don't have a time machine, well, whose fault is that? But of course, some of the same sorts of creatures do appear both in the big mythological stories and these smaller, more folkloric stories. For example, the dragon, as it appears in antiquity as a sort of giant serpent, is all over the mythology. Jormungand encircled the earth, Nidhogg chewed on the roots of the world tree, and Fafnir was a dwarf who turned into a dragon out of sheer greed. And it is a good thing that huge amounts of greed don't actually turn you into a dragon, because then, of course, the president would be a dragon, and I love dragons. Dragons are the best, so that is the sort of cognitive dissonance that I can do without. But, of course, there were dragons in non-deity stories as well. Scandinavian dragons were called lindorms or lindworms, and they were long and serpentine with two legs, sometimes depicted as front legs and sometimes as rear legs, because people in the olden days were bad at zoology. According to some sources, they liked to hang out in churchyards, though whether this was out of devoutness, a love for plate glass windows, or just enjoying watching the priests look uncomfortable is unrecorded. One Lindorm was called Val. He was called that because that's what his mother had named him back when he had been a human, before he, like Fafnir, had spent so much time brooding over his hoarded gold that he turned into a dragon. His sons actually joined him in this transformation because it's nice to do things as a family. These days, if a lot of people turned into dragons, their kids would just be so embarrassed. Val and his offspring were described as having helms on their heads and swords under their arms, and that is extremely weird. But wherever they were putting their swords, eventually the hero Thorir Oddsson got word of them and their treasure. He was told about it by a troll for the express purpose of getting Thorir to leave the troll and his treasure alone, because what Thorir wanted was cash, huge amounts of cash, and I have used the word hero here in a somewhat loose sense of the word. This all happened, we are told, by the way, in the time of Harald the Fair-Haired, so named to distinguish him from Harald the severely biased-haired. Thorir and his companions made their way into the dragon's lair, where the mighty worms slept atop their gold. This is, of course, a familiar image now, coming to us through Tolkien's Smaug, who, of course, got it himself from stories such as this one. Also, the old animated Smaug is better than the Peter Jackson Smaug, and I will fight you. In among the treasure there were some swords, and the men grabbed these to set to their dragon slaying, and I'm just going to stop you right there. Maybe there are some swords lying somewhere near the dragons. That's your plan? You didn't bring swords? Did everyone think it was someone else's job? You do not deserve the dragon's gold. But anyway, these apparent idiots stabbed the dragons under their shoulders, stabbing into their hearts, which is another callback to Sigurd and Fafnir. Unlike Fafnir, though, this didn't finish them off, and just as Thorir was removing Val's helmet for some reason, this is a remarkably baffling Keystone Cops sort of dragon slaying, the dragons all took off into the air, spewing fire and poison from their mouths, and flew out of the cave, Val carrying off Thorir's ally Thrond. As Val left the cave, another ally of Thorir's, Bjorn, who was waiting outside, saw the dragon coming with a man in his mouth. And so Bjorn took up his spear and thrust it into the worm, and for doing just about the only selfless and sensible thing anyone has done in this whole story, he was covered in very toxic dragon's blood, killing him instantly. That'll teach him. Everyone else lived happily ever after, presumably after running in circles confusedly for a while. Though it was said that Thorir himself later transformed into another dragon, himself overcome by obsession with hoarded gold. This has been a story about how everyone is lousy, or alternately, dead. Bananas though this story is, at its heart it is a simple dragon-slaying tale. Other Lindorm stories got weirder still. One time in Sweden, a queen consulted a soothsayer about her inability to have children, and he advised her that if she ate 2 fresh onions immediately upon arriving home, she would soon bear 2 handsome sons. Why didn't I think of that? She said, and rushed off. The soothsayer called after her, but she ignored him in her enthusiasm, possibly because she was a character in a fairy tale and therefore not much for making good decisions, and possibly because she was a queen, and by this point she'd had enough of the proles. She got home and immediately set to eating 2 onions, still so excited that she forgot to peel the first one, and this was gross. Apparently, that's what the story says. It was gross. I've never eaten an unpeeled onion and did not expect to need such experience to fully appreciate a dragon's story. Then she ate a peeled onion and then cut to 9 months later and she's giving birth to twins. But, oh no, the first one's a Lindorm, a horrible, coiling Lindorm. The queen threw it out the window into the neighboring forest. That was close, she said. I'm glad that Lindorm will never be relevant to our lives again. Luckily, the second son was people, so that was nice. Less nice was the time that son, the prince, now grown up, went into the forest, and there was the Lindorm, set faces to stunned. The Lindorm told him that he was the prince's older brother and that he, the prince, would not be able to marry until a willing bride was found for the dragon. This was apparently good enough for the prince, and he set about finding a bride for his brother, but the Lindorm's Tinder profile was just a mess and no one would consent to this. Finally, the soothsayer from before advised one young woman to agree to this, but to insist on their wedding night that for every garment she took off, the dragon would shed a layer of skin. Sounds great, said the young woman. I am a dragon and also your older brother. Tell the dragon to shed its skin a bunch and everything will be terrific. Apparently you could say anything to anyone in old Sweden and they would just go for it. As the young woman did, finding that, upon finishing all the shedding, the reptile was now himself a handsome prince. They got married, of course, and the soothsayer was invited to the wedding, and there he told the queen that he'd tried to tell her all those years ago that she had to peel the onions first. And then they both laughed, and the screen froze, and the credits rolled. This has been a story about the importance of peeling onions when engaged in supernatural conception methods, and of course, we can all stand to learn a little bit about that. A Finnish dragon gets a name, Agitar, and she lives in the forest and is sometimes depicted as a woman, or more recently as a sort of serpent woman. She spreads pestilence and also suckles snakes, and, that can't be good. Still, the woods were a lot more interesting in the olden days. Another great Swedish serpent is Storsjorduret, which I'm almost certainly mispronouncing, who lives in Lake Storsjön, has fins along its back, and the head of a dog, or maybe a cat, depending on who you ask. So either it really wants to be pals, or it just wants to knock things off of tables. Sightings of this one, which I am not going to attempt to pronounce again, continue to the present day. And indeed, in 1986, it was declared an endangered species with all of the protections so involved. Then in 2005, this protection was rescinded because the government had apparently been taken over by grown-ass people. And by grown-ass people, we here mean boring old lamewads. But whatever fame this lake monster may have achieved, it was as nothing as compared to another Scandinavian water monster, the Kraken. Remarkably, though, the Kraken may not be exactly what you think. The Scandinavians of old described it simply as a monster, 1.5 miles long, not 2 miles long, that's ridiculous, with a circle of horns or pointed fins aimed up from its back. It would rise from the sea, and these horns would protrude from the surface, often surrounding a luckless boat, and sometimes then closing in and grabbing it. Though this story was rare, the real danger of the Kraken was actually the swell of water it would create upon rising, and the whirlpool that would follow it back down. Not as sexy as being grabbed by giant horns, I grant you, but sailors had real problems. It wasn't all bad news, though. The rise would also force up fish, which could then be more easily caught. Oh, thanks, the Kraken. It wasn't until the early 19th century that the naturalist Denis de Montfort proposed that these horns were in fact the tentacles of the giant squid, an animal just becoming known at the time, which was presumably not really meant to make anyone feel any better. De Montfort is also responsible for this iconic picture of an octopus rather than a squid, and there are no octopuses this size, and that is not the only error in this piece. Alas. If I was a sailor on this boat, though, I would be positively yelling out, "This is why I became a sailor, to die like this, exactly like this." It is worth mentioning here that a sea serpent reported in 1734 by Hans Egede, Bishop of Greenland, which I imagine is a post with a lot of free time, was also theorized to be a giant squid with the main body and 2 fins sticking out of the water, and one of its many arms forming the apparent tail. Basically, they were super into deciding that everything was giant squids in the 19th century, is what I'm saying. Perhaps this is why giant squids are so popular in modern steampunk, just after goggles and gears that serve no purpose. But this is not Reverend Matt's Why in God's Name is Steampunk Doing That Science, so we will shelve such concerns for now. And it's no surprise that the 19th century was into the giant squid, because it was only just being discovered. It's a deep-sea creature, and indeed until the 19th century, the only evidence it existed came from dead sperm whales taken by whalers, which would have huge sucker marks on their skin. Giant squid have sharp, almost toothy rims on their suckers because squid are terrifying, and giant squid beaks in the stomachs of the sperm whales. And that was it. That was all they had. People just had to imagine the sperm whales diving to the lightless ocean depths and engaging in colossal battles with 60-foot squid. And indeed, we still have to. So let's all just do that right now. Isn't that nice? Then in the 1870s, a large number of intact giant squid carcasses washed up on beaches in Newfoundland, and we finally had full confirmation of the existence of these monstrous creatures. The reason why so many dead ones suddenly appeared is unknown, but many believe that they were victims of a huge giant squid civil war with electro rays and giant underwater robots, and by many, I mean me. As exciting as all this is, there is much to be said for the colossal, mysterious, horn-backed creature, and the seafaring Scandinavians had a terrific imagination for ocean animals. In 1555, we are told, off the Scandinavian island of Thailand, an island known from such sources as this one and nowhere else ever, somebody caught an enormous pig-headed creature, 72 feet long, 14 feet deep, 7 feet between the eyes. Quick, someone measure how far it is between the eyes. With a liver so large, it took 5 casks to hold it. Wait, how big is the liver? We need to know how big the liver is in casks. It had 6 eyes on the sides of its body and a crescent-shaped dorsal fin, and was presumably animated by Terry Gilliam. There are those who would say that old-timey sailors had too much time on their hands if they're making up stories like this, but frankly, if this is true, how do we give them more? Somewhat similar is the Norwegian havhest, with the head of a horse and the body of a fish or serpent. Also, sometimes it had yellow eyes and 2 rows of terrible fangs, and also breathed fire because horse-headed ocean snake or fish isn't interesting enough for you, apparently. This is almost certainly related to the also Norwegian Roswaler, a horse-headed whale. Now, what you have to understand about the Roswaler is that it is generally believed by folklorists and Gulf chlorists to be a misidentification of the walrus. They even have the same name and everything, just mixed up, because of how horse-headed a walrus is. Horse? Horse? Still in all, this is kind of par for the course for ancient zoology. It is widely and rightly considered that the lovely unicorn started off as a misidentification of the rhinoceros, because people returned from their travels and all they could think of to describe what they saw was it was a horse with a horn on its head. Here's a crocodile from an old illustration. I genuinely do not know what is going on. Talking of creatures with mammal heads and fish tails, of course there are mermaids in Scandinavian stories. Also, there are mermen, but nobody cares about those. Mermaids. This gender focus is probably largely to do with these being sailors' stories, and sailors being largely men. I mean, you can't put women on a boat for a variety of, boat reasons. And so sailors made up beautiful women of the sea because lonely men get weird. So I'm told, I have no idea. And they invent women who have no legs and are therefore impossible to have sex with. Again, weird. Scandinavian mermaids are called havfruen. Actually, they're called a number of things, but this Danish name is sort of a nice middle ground. Like many European mermaids, they are ambiguous, sometimes rescuing drowning sailors, sometimes luring sailors into the water to die, but one way or the other, generally very interested in reversing your drowned versus non-drowned status. They also had the gift of prophecy, mostly about upcoming storms. They would drive their white cows up onto the shore before a storm because they had some white cows there in the ocean. Presumably, this was a metaphor for sea foam. Some people imagined that sea foam was cows from the sea, probably because they were having a slow afternoon. It wasn't always about storms, though. One havfru predicted the birth of King Christian IV, and sometimes you're sitting in a boat and a mermaid shows up and predicts the birth of King Christian IV, and you just work with that. The males of the species were more benevolent than the females and had blue or green hair and beards. And in 1719, one was sighted that had the forepaws of a seal calf and was also 28 feet long. And I feel like we're doing some damage to taxonomy here. That is not a merman, that is something else. There were some regional variants. The Finnish Nakanaito had long blonde hair that she was constantly combing, as well as breasts so large that she could toss them back over her shoulders. And I'm not sure if that was supposed to be hot at the time, but it is a concept that is largely unexplored in modern pornography anyway, which is saying something. Marbendils were merseals who, unlike the fish people, were usually male and stocky and bald and short armed, expressions of the universal concept, the ineffable archetype of combining a seal with Danny DeVito. They had the gift of prophecy, also like Danny DeVito, and if you caught one in your fishing net, it could use this gift to bargain its way to freedom because you apparently are an enormous D-bag. Just let the seal man go, for God's sake. Its prophecies were mostly about the sea, the location of good fishing, coming storms, that sort of thing, though it could also tell you how you were going to die, and you couldn't change that or know when it was, so that seems like a super useful and healthy thing to know. Rounding out our overview of ocean people is the monkfish, part monk, which would be occasionally sighted off of Norway, and which obviously filled the Northern Ocean's ecological need for a cloistered priesthood. Obviously, a lot of nonsense, but there is a real animal called the monkfish. It looks like this. Somebody decided that this was a fish that reminded them of a monk, so maybe stay away from monasteries. And such were the people of the waters that the sailors spoke of. But so too did the landlocked have such people. In the rivers, one could find the nixes, or the nixies, or the nooks, or the neckers, or all sorts of things like that. They appeared as humans, or as mer-humans, or humans with giant snake tails for legs, or as old men with horned hats, or beautiful white horses with their hooves pointing the wrong way, or as handsome young centaurs, or as golden-haired boys with red caps, or dogs, or floating logs, or empty boats, or grass snakes, or haystacks, or gray horses, or elderly fox centaurs with horse hooves. I have not made any of this up. Now, this is all because they were shape changers, and also because Scandinavian folklore lacked editorial oversight. For the most part, it was said that if you left the nixes alone, they would leave you alone. Though in spite of this, there were a number of rules that you should follow to keep them from getting squirrely. You should keep a knife or a metal object on the bottom of your boat to keep them away, this being related to the widespread European idea that the fairy folk were vulnerable to iron, this being symbolic of them being ancient creatures of the old ways, ill adapted to your fancy metallurgy, and also the music you listen to is nothing but a bunch of damn noise. Some traditions went so far as to suggest that you shouldn't rescue drowning people, as these had been claimed by the Nixes, and generally these sorts of stories were meant to be symbolic, cautionary tales, recommending behavior of genuine benefit to yourself or your community. This one said, don't save drowning people. Cold, Scandinavia. Cold. Even more serious still, some communities sacrificed someone to their local Nix once a year because they took the mermen in the river very seriously indeed. Finally, if you saw one in horse form, you were not supposed to mount it, as it would carry you off into the river to drown. You know what? Let's just open this up. When you see unfamiliar creatures out in the wilderness, generally, don't climb on top of them. Left alone, what they would mostly do is sing and play music, usually on harps, but in a statistically significant number of cases on guitars. Sometimes they would teach a lucky human their musical skill, though the human had to be careful that they were not taught the Elf King's tune, which they would then be forced to play forever, like the Song That Never Ends by Sherry Lewis and Lamb Chop. There were only two ways to be rid of the curse: to play the song backwards, or for someone to come up behind you and cut the strings of your instrument. Which is why people would do that. Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you were playing the Elf King's tune. I was trying to save your life. There were a few other ways that Nixes and humans would interact. The men would seduce human women and to go and live underwater with them, and sometimes a Nyx woman would marry a human man and live with him for a time, though ultimately she would be reclaimed by her people. One story claims that they would help humanity by making the price of grain fall in markets by buying at high prices. And maybe that's not how it works, but magic. And also, it is so rarely that the business majors are allowed to write the folk tales. Also, if you met a young woman at the market and the bottom of her dress was dripping wet, you could be assured that this was a Nyx, because Nyx women were absolutely compelled to go to human markets. And the long, deep history of women as supernatural monsters is filled with all manner of patriarchal misogyny. Women are seductresses, hags, motherhood made evil, a proverbial bingo card of sexism. But for all that, this is actually one of the very, very few global legends with a theme of women be shopping. A regional variant of the Nyx was the Norwegian Stromkarl, meaning riverman. These lived in waterfalls, and they knew 11 melodies, the 11th being Otto's irresistible dance, Nerd. And it could teach these melodies to a human. All the human had to do was approach the water on a Thursday evening with their eyes averted and a black lamb in their right hand, whereupon the Stromkarl would take the lamb and then the hand, which it would thrash about until the hand bled, and abracadabra, supernatural musical skill. Now you feel silly for taking all those guitar lessons. Now, we have spoken of the iron allergy of the Fae and of the Elf King's tune and such like, and this brings us to the more traditional fairies of Scandinavia, the magical weirdo outsiders of the forests. These are related to the grand entities of Norse mythology, specifically the Alfar, from which we derive our word elf. The Alfar were the grand, mighty sort of elf, the glorious, beautiful, mysterious people who came before. And for those of you new to Reverend Matt's Monster Science, please be advised that I shoehorn in pictures of Cate Blanchett at every possible opportunity. It's surprisingly easy, but I'd still do it if it were difficult. But as God-challenging dragons became sort of difficult older brothers, and grand English elves became Santa's helpers and on shelves, so too did the Alfar become more local and more weird. The Huldras, meaning hidden, and the Skogsras, meaning forest spirits, were two sorts of entities that are sometimes counted separately, but which are sufficiently similar that we will consider them as one tonight. These were forest people that were human-like, and like mermaids, mostly we talked about the women. These were very beautiful. They were supernatural women. It was either they were beautiful or they were hideous. No supernatural women are just sort of presentable. Maybe eerily presentable. But the Skogsras all had cows' tails, and in most cases they were said to have hollow backs, perhaps presenting as a black void, perhaps being full of its own innards, and perhaps full of rotting leaves and other forest detritus. They would attempt to conceal their tails and their backs, usually through the magic of facing you, or at other times through the magic of clothing. But they were shapeshifters as well, appearing as owls and as whirlwinds, and could also turn invisible. Indeed, when considered as the Huldras, this was their default state. It is said by some that in the olden days, the Skogsras and the humanity were friends, that the Skogsras taught us animal husbandry as well as dancing and playing the flute. There's a lovely story of a human repairing a Skogsra's wheelbarrow. Wheelbarrows seem like a weird thing for forest spirits to have, frankly. Did he also repair her Nintendo? We veered off topic. For this, she paid him with wood chips, which was probably pretty irritating at first, but then the man got home and found that they had turned into gold. And the moral of that is when magical forest entities give you dumb stuff, just take it. But over time, the Skogsras became darker. Some say that this was because of the coming of Christianity, destroying and demonizing local traditions. And what an imaginative idea that is. Name me one time that the coming of Christianity has harmed local belief systems. Okay, 2. Okay, 10,000. The Skogsras now became succubi, seductresses, leading men off into the forest never to be seen again, or sometimes letting them go home after first leading them out, only for them to go out and visit the Skogsra every night, obsessed and enslaved. They were the mystery of the deep woods and the weird primal terror of women's sexuality. And fellas, women's sexuality is not so bad. Indeed, if you think of it from a certain point of view, it might even have some advantages to those of you who are heterosexual. Anyway, in other stories, Skogsras just caught people in invisible nets because some storytellers are more poetic than others. Luckily, there was all kinds of stuff you could do to keep them away. They were repelled by steel and garlic, and if you found yourself being led astray, you could turn your coat or socks inside out and say the paternoster backwards, which would get rid of the Skogsra, presumably by making it so confused. They liked quiet. They were afraid of thunder and wolves and the color red sometimes, and could be wounded by one of their own hairs fired out of a shotgun. So, do that. It's like you're not even trying. If you were trapped in one of their invisible nets, you could be freed by the sound of a church bell. And they also hated caraway seeds in baked bread. These stories were specific. These people paid a lot of attention to the Skogsras, though, in their defense, I sure would too. If you drew a circle on the ground with ashes, they would be unable to enter it, but you would then also be unable to leave it without them taking you away. Ever. You would never be able to leave. So maybe put a couch in there first. Maybe some comic books. You could enter into written contracts with them for the right to hunt in their forests, and in some stories, they would leave you alone if you just left them some meat. That's not a metaphor, perverts, just actual meat. Stupid men say that it's hard to know what women really want, but it's really quite simple. Choice cuts of meat. One story gives another anti-Skogsra technique. It seemed there was a man who had been claimed by a Skogsra but allowed to return home, obsessed with her, and he went out into the woods to visit her at every possible chance. His friends tried to restrain him, but to no avail, and so finally they just followed him out into the woods. And when the Skogsra who had claimed him appeared, one of them used the craftiest, most cunning method of safely dealing with this eerie supernatural threat. He shot her, not with one of her hairs, just bang. So, why do we even have all these rules? Well, I'll tell you. The Skogsra went down, but then the rest of the Skogsras of the forest appeared. One of them pointed at the gunman, and his aiming eye was gone, just disappeared. An empty socket was all that was left. And the Skogsras took their sister away. And the man was freed, but at some price. And to think all of this could have been avoided if somebody had just offered them maybe a rack of ribs. Somewhat unusually, the Skogsras, in their Huldra identity, had an origin story. Once there was a woman who was the recipient of a surprise visit from God. Sometimes God just shows up. It's a little rude, but he usually brings a dessert. It's fine. This woman, sometimes an innocent rando or rando Calrissian, and sometimes Lilith, Adam's first wife, who turned out evil partially because she wanted to be on top, and that is honestly supposed to be part of it. Anyway, here she is with Ozzy Osbourne. The woman saw God coming, and some of her children were filthy at the time, and that was obviously no good, so she hid all the dirty ones. During God's visit, he asked if the available children were all of her kids. Yes, she said, very convincingly. Well, you've got to get up pretty early in the morning to pull one over on God, and he saw through this, and in his rage, this appears to have been the Old Testament anger management problems God, said, "Let those not revealed remain concealed," and the hidden children were turned invisible and stayed that way forever. And also became seductresses with holes in their backs. Apparently, we can't spoon feed you everything. Now, the Skogsras took care of their own, as we have seen, but mostly they were just weird hot girls in the forest, those, and they were not associated with guarding the forest as so many forest spirits are. In Finland, that role went to entities called the Metsähaltijas. They appeared as old men with long gray beards, with clothing made of forest lichens, and they could change size to be as small as a blade of grass or as tall as the tallest tree in the woods. Presumably, it is in this latter size that they would protect the forests. Otherwise, we are not given a lot of details as to how they did this. Maybe they just shot people too. Maybe the Scandinavian folklore is a lot more like Fast and the Furious movies than we are generally led to believe. Also, guarding the Finnish forests were the liekos, which appeared as eerie, mysterious lights in the woods, of the sort that we would nowadays call will-o'-the-wisps. These are an actual phenomenon, and an unmistakably spooky one, and as such, almost every culture that experiences it has a supernatural story for it. In Finland, they were caused by children who had been buried in the woods, then to roam it as invisible wraiths, only their torches visible. And in this form, they would protect the forest. And yes, I'm much less scared of the giant old guy than I am of this. Finally, as far as forest people are concerned, there was the also Finnish Uda, who looked like a naked person with his or her feet turned backwards. And Uda would appear to you while you were out in the woods and invite you to either dance or wrestle. You could usually tell which one it was going to be ahead of time by whether or not it had entrance music. If you accepted this offer, the Uda would either dance you to death or tickle you to death. You'd think that with the wrestling, that fighting you to death would also be an option, but that's just not how forest creatures roll. Anyway, the moral of this is that when you're in the forest and a naked person shows up and wants to wrestle you, tell them no. Another major thread through global stories of fairies, which I have spelled like this in the script because we are talking about grown-up fairy stuff, hardcore stuff for two-fisted street fighters about fairies, is the household spirit, the fairy that does your housework while you sleep at night. Some folklore is about dire warnings of natural disaster or the evils in the depths of the human soul. Some of it is about wild flights of fancy, the far realms of the boundless human imagination. And some of it is cheap pipe dreams. In any case, these stories are a sort of explanation for the phenomenon of waking up in the morning to find all of your housework already done. You know, that. There exists some debate as to the degree that the tellers of these sorts of stories that we are discussing tonight actually believed what they were saying. In the case of household spirits, these are perhaps the most demonstrably, provably untrue things that anyone has ever said. Nevertheless, the Scandinavians had a bunch of them. In Norway, there was the Nissa, who looked like a small bearded man in gray clothing and a red pointy hat, and sometimes with thick fur all over his body, no thumbs, and a huge lower lip. They lived in barns and would help out with the farm and housework surreptitiously, in exchange for which they asked that people on the farm didn't swear or urinate where they weren't supposed to. And you know what, Nissa? You've got a deal. They also didn't like a lot of noise or being given clothing, this latter being an insult to their volunteerism. In exchange for their work, what the Nissa liked was porridge with a pat of butter on top. In one story, the farmer that a Nissa lived with one time put the butter underneath the porridge. Not seeing the butter, the Nissa did what any one of us would do, which was fly into a blind rage and kill the farmer's cow. He then ate the porridge anyway, and finding the butter to be there after all, he was filled with remorse, and so he went and stole a neighbor's nearly identical cow to replace his farmer's cow with. It's a heartwarming tale of uncontrollable fury and barnyard animal theft, and I don't know why there aren't 100 Hallmark Channel movies about it already. It also teaches us a valuable lesson about God knows what. A variant on the Nissa, and in some stories an actual transformation of it, an annual transformation of it, was the Yule Nissa, the Yule Nissa. This would go around in a sleigh pulled by reindeer, albeit reindeer that couldn't fly, so yawn, snore fest, and it would knock on people's front doors and hand presents directly to their children, which lacks the magic and mystery of the stockings and the chimneys we know, but if you want to complain to the supernatural creature giving you free stuff, be my guest. Obviously, this was a large part of the inspiration for the modern concept of Santa Claus, and therefore, ultimately, for the film Santa Claus Conquers the Martians. The Swedish version of the Nissa was called the Tomte. It was fairly similar to the Nissa in most respects, though there were stories about the Tomte that said that they had not always been as they were now. Once they had been the old ones, the people who had built the old ruins, you would sometimes find. They had been skilled in magic and crafts. One would think that magic would be enough, but also crafts. And as humans became more and more numerous, the Tomtes would harass them at first, but later came to doing farm work in exchange for gifts, and then eventually becoming full household spirits. Still, some whispers of their former skill and independence remained. Sometimes a Tomte would teach someone fiddling, and they were known to gather in the wilderness and dance during full moons. On Thursdays, Tomtes would take their holiday, and it would be best if you gave them a little extra food and kept the house a little quieter. On Christmas, you'd want to give them some tobacco, a small piece of gray cloth, and a shovelful of clay. What they could possibly be doing with these things is again not described, but again, just do it. One thing not to do is threaten your Tomte with a pitchfork. One time, a boy did this, and so that night, the Tomte dragged him out of his bed and threw him all the way over his house, and then repeated this a further 7 times, ultimately leaving the boy in the gutter. Even if they're basically volunteer house staff, supernatural entities are always hardcore, and you have to remember that. Another thing that Tomtes would do was increase the wealth and goods of the household. They would do this by just straight up stealing from the neighbors, which is amazing. We have here made gentle sport of the idea of household spirits explaining something that doesn't happen, but here we are seeing something else. Why is all of my wife's jewelry in your house? Oh, that Tomte. Wonderful. This was actually a common thread among Scandinavian household spirits. The Finnish krahi looked like an ordinary domestic animal, a cat maybe, or a rooster, but it could fly through the air in the form of a ball of fire, which striking magical power it used to steal from the neighbors. This was sort of set up by its story a little bit. Unlike the Nissas and Tomtes, which you had in your house because of blind, dumb luck, people gained the services of Krahis on purpose by making deals with the devil, exchanging their souls for a household spirit. Some people really don't like housework. Of course, usually at the ends of these stories, the heroes would get their souls back through trickery or legal mumbo jumbo, which is actually in keeping with a certain thread of Christian teachings, which basically have it so that you can commit all the evil you want, just genocide galore, so long as you feel super bad about it sometime later. In the far north, the Lapp people spoke of the Smiera Gato, meaning buttercat, and my whole Facebook feed has just heard the words buttercat and has let out an ongoing high-pitched scream of delight that I can hear even from here, because my Facebook feed exists physically someplace far away. That is apparently what I'm saying. Anyway, the buttercat was also a thief, stealing butter and other produce. And eat it fast, guys. We don't know if the neighbor is going to accept the buttercat explanation a 37th time. But helping out and also larceny were not the only ways in which a fairy creature might appear in your home. In Sweden, a killakop was what they called a changeling, a fairy left in a home in exchange for a human baby, which had been taken away by the fairies because they just loved human babies. There were a number of possible ways to know that your baby was a killakop. Perhaps it had a small tail, or its feet were overlarge, or hooved, or clawed. Perhaps it could communicate with animals, or indeed completely fluently in a human language in spite of being a little tiny baby. If that happened, you knew something strange was going on. Regardless, you were stuck with it. Sometimes killacops were helpful, even angelic, and sometimes they were unholy terrors, and since exactly the same thing may be said about human children, let's just call it a wash. Another entity associated with humans was the Fylgja, a sort of guardian spirit that was handed down through a family line. A Fylgja looked like an animal, or maybe like a Valkyrie. I want the Valkyrie guardian spirit. That sounds rad, though it actually doesn't really matter because it never fights for you or anything, or even steal butter on your behalf. So what is left, even? Well, it's this. Your Fylgja would appear in your dreams to give you warnings or advice. But if you saw it while you were awake, that meant you were about to die, and now this isn't fun anymore. Not in the oceans or the forests or your house, but rather underground were the Dwergar, conceptual descendants of the Svartalfar, the dark elves of the Grand Norse myths. These had been what we would call the dwarves, the squat underground people who were very skilled at metalworking and the creation of magical objects, and so it was with the Dwergar. They were further described as having dark skin burned that way from the forges, as well as green eyes and the feet of crows, and that last part certainly came out of nowhere, but it's obviously not the most random thing we've heard tonight. They were also so used to living underground that they would die or be turned to stone if exposed to sunlight, which is a famous feature of trolls, and of course there's a lot of bleed through with creatures like this, traits moving from one variety to another. They didn't have canon-obsessed monster scholars in those days, and if they had, there wouldn't have been any Twitch channels for them to talk on every Thursday evening. The Dwergar were possessed of invisibility cloaks, it was said, which is to say cloaks that made you invisible, not cloaks that were themselves invisible. There wouldn't be a whole lot of point to that, maybe staying warm without anybody even knowing, ha, those suckers. This was bad that they had invisibility cloaks because the Dwergar were evil, as I have drawn them. They meant us harm, but usually not in a particularly proactive way. So again, just leave the invisible people with the crow's feet alone. I cannot stress this enough. Also, evil and coming up from underground were the Draugr, and here we move away from the Fey folk into the undead. Indeed, one of the very few varieties of undead in all of Europe that wasn't either a vampire or a ghost. And we have seen the variety of forms and attributes attached to many of our creatures tonight, given them by their countless storytellers over great spans of space and time. But for some reason, when it comes to the undead, the wheels just come off. The Draugr are reanimated corpses that mostly rise to guard their own tombs, and then sometimes they are also mean and violent to the living of whom they are jealous. But beyond that, anything goes. They are rotting like zombies, or entirely skeletal, or look just as they did in life. They can tell the future, change their size, control the weather, enter people's dreams, change into a seal or a horse with a broken back and no tail or ears, shrug off the attacks of weapons, create darkness, cast 7th level spells at will, throw a basketball into a hoop while facing away from that hoop. It just never stops. They could also change into cats, though significantly, they never do seem to change specifically into buttercats. Also, in one story, any birds that flew over a Draugr's tomb would just fall from the sky dead, which would actually probably be pretty scary in real life, but just sitting here thinking about it is kind of hilarious. To prevent a corpse from rising as a Draugr, you would raise and lower it 3 different directions before final burial in order to confuse the Draugr. Apparently, its big vulnerability was getting lost. Also, do not bury a Draugr with a MapQuest capable device. Rising could also be prevented by putting iron scissors on the corpse's chest, hiding straws in their clothes, or by tying their big toes together, which seems like maybe not exactly overkill for a shape-changing, size-changing entity, but I don't make the rules. Another sort of undead was the Kyrkogrim, a spectral dog or boar that would guard a churchyard, specifically the graveyard attached to it. This would be created on purpose by the church. A living dog or boar would be killed, sacrificed, frankly, and buried under the foundation stone of a new church, creating the Kyrkogrim. I think we can all agree that this is surprisingly metal for the Mother Church. But what you've got to understand is that the first entity to be buried on church grounds would inevitably come back as a ghostly defender. Everybody knows that. That's just science. And so this was done to an animal to prevent a human from having to take on this eternal and usually very boring job. Not always boring, though. There was a Swedish form of folk divination called the Ursgång, the year walk, in which the practitioner would walk through the woods in the dead of night, encountering various supernatural entities, and then in the end come to a church where they would have to overcome the Kyrkogrim. And in reward for this, they would receive visions of the coming year. Me, I'd do the whole thing just to see the Kyrkogrim, but it is probably true that if creatures like this were real, I would have gotten too close to one and been eviscerated or lured into the woods or something like that decades ago. It's fine. It's what I would have wanted. Also canine was the Gulon, a creature of the north with a fox tail and huge claws and a long body, described as being between those of a lion and a hyena. And look. Throughout this talk, we have heard descriptions based on frames of reference that don't make sense to us, but probably did to old Scandinavians. But nobody in the history of time has been aided in envisioning the body of an animal by being told it was between a lion's and a hyena's. Not carnivore biologists, nobody. So, we'll just move on to its behavior. Gulons ate carrion, and the gases of the putrefying flesh would make it swell up like a balloon. So in order to make room for more eating, a Gulon would squeeze its body between two close trees to get the gases out. Now, obviously, imagining this is a marvelous way to relax, but we were actually told that this was for practical reasons. This squeezing behavior was the best time to kill a Gulon, when it was relatively helpless. And you wanted to kill a Gulon for its fur or for its blood, the latter of which was mixed with honey and drunk at weddings, where presumably you could tell everyone the story of the drink's origin, and in so doing, make new friends, and also enemies. Talking of weird animals, the Northern Lapps spoke of the vuoho, essentially an enormous bird, a rock of sorts, that would later appear briefly in the poem The Destiny of Nations by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who is perhaps best known for the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, a truly important, epic poem that was later turned into a truly important, epic Iron Maiden song. And then, of course, there are the trolls. There is perhaps no creature more emblematic of Scandinavian folklore than the trolls. This word has come to mean a huge variety of things, from the beings in Norse mythology sufficiently powerful to challenge the warrior gods of Asgard to these things here. There's a famous story of one attempting to importune some goats. They log on to the internet and attempt to make people angry for no reason. The list goes on. And as such, we do not have time to cover their variety tonight. But please keep an eye out for the third show in this series, Tales of Giants and Trolls, coming soon to an internet near you. Thank you. Now we'll go to the Q&A. A few little weird announcements, though, beforehand. Let me switch this whole thing over. Stop doing this. Okay, very good. Now here and now here. Hello, everybody. Thank you. I like the drawings too. I'm fairly happy with them. Okay, so couple of announcements. First of all, this is dedicated to Amber Bjork. Second of all, thanks to Boo Segerson, who helped me with the Scandinavian pronunciation. Any errors are mine. Third of all, as I said at the beginning, if you would like to donate, there's a button down below the screen, or I'm Matthew Kesson on Venmo. And if you're here because of Norway House or want to donate to Norway House, please say that in the comments, and I'll get them their money. And fourth of all, a new thing is that these are being recorded, and I've started putting them up on YouTube every Monday. I'm putting them up. I've put one up already, and I'll put one up on this upcoming Monday. And so yeah, so tell your friends to come and look at it. It's Matthew Kesson's YouTube channel. I'm still messing with it. I might get a fancier name later on. Let's see. Please spread the word. I'd love for more people to see this. This is a very word of mouth sort of situation. I have a website, RevMattsMonsterScience.com, and I'm on all the social media as Reverend Matt or Reverend Matt 3000. And also, upcoming shows next Thursday. It's every Thursday at 8. And next Thursday, I'm going to be doing another new show, much as this one was, although it's a bit of a clip show next week, called Better Armageddons Than This, the monsters of apocalypses, which are big and huge and metal as anything. And it's very fun and very exciting and much better than what's happening right now, as is literally everything. So look out for that. Week after that, I'm going to do a show that I've done once at the Convergence Convention called How to Remake a Monster, all about monster movie remakes. And we'll go forward from there. It'll all be on the various social media. So let's go to the Q&A. Let me see what you got. Ask me some questions. Where can I get a buttercat? Finland. Actually, no, that's not true. Lapland, the far north of Scandinavia, Norway and Sweden. That's where the buttercats are. The buttercats do as they like, as cats in general will, and supernatural creatures. I mean, it's kind of a double thing, you know? I mean, there's supernatural creatures and cats. There's no way to get either of those things to do what you want. So that's where you can get a buttercat, which is to say you can't. Okay, that's up. More questions. Give me some more questions. There's a lot more weird stuff about all of this. Are buttercats healthy or unhealthy to eat? That's my friend Jim Lewis. Anyone who knows Jim Lewis may go to his home and beat him within inches of his life. No, they're unhealthy to eat. I mean, too much butter is bad for you. And then also, if you eat cats, most anyone I know finds out about it, they will, as I have just now suggested, beat you to within inches of your life. Tell us about the encyclopedia show that you were involved in. I'd love to know more about that for some reason. This upcoming April 14th, I'm part of the encyclopedia show. Doc, tell me, refresh my memory. My brain is kind of elsewhere. But yeah, April 14th, the Encyclopedia Show, which is actually where Reverend Matt's Monster Science got its start. It's a show where a topic is selected, and we give 8 minutes or so to some of the best performers in the Twin Cities to talk about that topic, or do a song about that topic, or a poem about their topic, or whatever. Usually it's little talks, but we get as much variety as we can. So that's coming up on April 14th. I'm one of the producers and hosts of that, and so that's always just a bunch of fun. So check that out. Look up the Encyclopedia Show Minneapolis on Facebook and on other sorts of things. Amber asks me, have you ever seen a will-o'-the-wisp or any kind of spirit lights? No, I have not. One thing that is, I mean, that was a photo of one. They're a verifiably real phenomenon. One thing that is true about me being a person that I am, having a bit of a reputation for knowing about monsters and weird crap, is that people do tell me about their UFO and Bigfoot encounters. But this is, and I don't know that these things are real, but I'm always impressed by their honesty. But that's another story entirely. But I've never seen one. Have you? Has anyone seen a will-o'-the-wisp? That would be amazing. But like I said, they're completely real. Let's see. But like, how important is butter to Scandinavian folklore? How often do you encounter that? Well, think about being a Scandinavian these days. People sort of overstate how miserable it was in medieval times, but it's certainly nothing like now. Butter was delicious. Butter was one of the best things that you ate on a regular basis, and so. I mean, think about how great butter is now. Think about when it's one of the best possible eating things you have. Of course it is. Yay for butter. In what way did Vikings react to these creatures? Violence? Well, I mean, the Thorir Oddsson story where they went and killed a dragon so stupidly. That was one of them. For the most part, these were not creatures that you don't. And then obviously in a more recent story, somebody just shoots one of the Skogsra. So yeah, violence was a thing. I mean, the Vikings ran around and pillaged and stuff, and their gods were warlike for gods, but the Vikings also did other stuff. They were storytellers and musicians and all kinds of things like that. The idea that they were some exclusively warrior race is a little bit overstated. So they could have these stories about weird women in the forest that didn't involve having to go and chop them to pieces, because life, there was more to life than chopping things to pieces, even if you were a Viking. I'm having trouble scrolling up. It looks like there's some interesting questions, but there we go. All right. Ooh, angry mob. Oh yes. What's the story behind the pin you always wear? Yeah. Just a second. The pin I always wear is not on that one. I'm used to mirrors, and this is not a mirror. This is a screen. The pin I always wear. I bumped things. Is Smaug, as he is depicted on one of the maps from The Hobbit, as drawn by Tolkien. And the story behind it is I bought it, and the reason that it's the pin I always wear is that I love Smaug the dragons and the giant reptiles are my favorite thread of monsters. Smaug is one of the best just characters that is a dragon or giant reptile. I just love his bravado and his confidence, and also around the same time that I first started Reverend Matt's Monster Science, I was in a theatrical production of The Hobbit, in which I was the voice of Smaug, and it was just one of the best roles I've ever had. And so I feel for Smaug. I feel strongly about Smaug. In the spirit of the upcoming holidays, any Easter/equinox myths or monsters? Easter is not heavy on the monsters, which is kind of, I don't really have a reason for that. I mean, obviously the Easter bunny. I mean, the way I count monsters is monsters are creatures that aren't real, although there's some finesse to that. Robots will often count. Cartoon animals kind of don't, even though they're talking animals, but they're not abominations, you know. The Easter Bunny is kind of a monster because the Easter Bunny is a sentient, often gigantic talking rabbit, but no, not so much. I mean, I do have a whole show that some of you may have seen about Christmas, because there's tons of Christmas monsters, but that's because we care a lot more about Christmas than we do about Easter. I mean, Easter's great, yeah, Easter, but if that's your thing, but no, there's not a bunch of them, and nothing really coming out off the top of my head about equinox, but I'm sure there's more of it. Were any of these myths brought to the U.S.? Did people start seeing buttercats here? One thing I need you to understand is that the buttercats are, in actual folkloric studies, relatively minor. They were the lap people, and that's it, and just a bit of weirdness. It is because it's 2020 and we're all obsessed with cats that you're also excited about buttercats. Historically, the world was not as excited about buttercats as we are right now. As far as, well, I mean, now the Eulenissa is huge. Is one of the biggest surviving myths because combined with Saint Nicholas and certain Odin qualities, the Eulenissa is Santa Claus. So that's, yeah. I mean, talk about a bigger legendary entity in the modern world than Santa Claus, and the reindeer and the red clothing and the gift giving and all that come from the Eulenissa. So the Skogsur don't really show up. The Kraken is obviously still very popular. Not a lot of these really, not a lot of them, came over in a recognizable form, but one of them that did is one of the biggest of all of them. Why is it so hard to scroll up, my friends? Why is that a thing? There we go. Easter witches in Sweden, sure. I know for being pagan for years that Ostara's spirits for the holiday are dragons and mermaids. Excellent, very good. The serpent or Kundalini is the closest to is the closest to otherworldly non-humanoid god energies for Ostara or Equinox. Very nice. But as to what they did during Ostara, I don't know. What's your favorite Scandinavian dragon? Well, now we've of course missed. Yule-Nissa does indeed rule. All hail Yule-Nissa. What's my favorite Scandinavian dragon? It's hard. I I guess I have to go with Needhogg, who was in the first of this series, who is an enormous dragon that gnaws at the roots of Yggdrasil, the world tree, and just gnaws at it forever and can't really make any headway, which is a shame, but it's a big, terrible thing. And then it is seen at Ragnarok flying through the sky with corpses hanging out of its jaws. And if you painted that on the side of a van, the van would explode and create another van. That I don't. So yeah, I got to go with Needhogg. I like good old Needhogg, just because he's huge and weird. Let's see. This sounds like a fringe show or a great metal band. Needhogg. Oh, absolutely. Just a fringe show about just Yggdrasil alone, or all the creatures running up and down it. Eventually, I will record or redo the Norse mythology monster science, and man, it's the thing. Yeah, Norwegian black. I mean, it's no mistake that that the Scandinavians are big into really serious heavy metal, because their stories come from this, literally. I mean, it's the men with the axes and the dragons and the wolves and stuff. I mean, there's literally no mythology, not Greek, not Egyptian, not Japanese, not anyone that is more metal than Scandinavian and mythology. And that's not a weird coincidence. That's because it's kind of where it comes from, you know. I mean, comes from Tolkien, who drew heavily on it, and it comes from Led Zeppelin talking about Tolkien and Immigrant Song and all that stuff. Guess let's roll up our sleeves from Metal Norwegian Dragon Show. I'm in. Nissa, let's do this. Yeah, absolutely. There's a bunch of them. There's the two or three we did tonight, including Ajatar, and then the Norse ones are the mythological ones are Needhogg and Jormungand, the World Serpent, and Fafnir, who we talked about, who was a dwarf who turned into a dragon from being super greedy. So yeah, absolutely. Let's roll up our sleeves and do that. Yeah. See, everybody's into it. Look at this. Yes. So any further questions, you guys? Come on now. Just more enthusiasm for the Metal Dragon Fringe show. Yeah, well, I can't blame you for that. All right. Well, we're gonna call that an evening. Thank you so much for tuning in. Let's donate if you can. That would be lovely, and let me know if it's for Norway House. Thanks again to Boo Segerson, and have an excellent week. And we'll see you back here next Thursday for better Armageddons than this. Thank you so much. Now I awkwardly turn it off.